A man sits alone at a corner table in a busy cafe, nursing a single cup of coffee that's gone cold, his weathered military jacket wrapped around shoulders that once stood straight with pride. His beard is unkempt, his clothes worn, and his backpack contains everything he owns in the world. When two police officers approach his table in response to a complaint that he's loitering and making customers uncomfortable, the man doesn't argue or plead. He simply reaches into his pocket, pulls out a battered cell phone, makes one quiet call, and says 7 words. "Sir, I need you at Morrison's Café." What happens in the next 20 minutes doesn't just change the trajectory of one homeless veteran's day. It exposes the invisible crisis of veteran homelessness, challenges every assumption the cafe staff and police made about the man they'd judged, and reveals a network of military brotherhood that transcends rank, status, and circumstance. This is the story of how one phone call connected a forgotten hero to the support system that should have caught him before he ever ended up on the streets, and why what happened afterward became a catalyst for an entire community rethinking how they treat their most vulnerable veterans. Stay with me, because this story will break your heart before it rebuilds it, and by the end, you'll understand why we measure our society not by how we treat our heroes when they're in uniform, but by how we treat them when they're broken and invisible. Let me introduce you to Robert "Bobby" Thompson, because his story represents both an individual tragedy and a systemic failure that affects tens of thousands of American veterans. Bobby was 52 years old, a former Marine Corps staff sergeant who'd served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan during the height of the conflicts. He'd been decorated for valor, had led men in combat, and had returned home to what he'd thought would be the peace and stability he'd fought to protect. Instead, like so many veterans, Bobby came home carrying invisible wounds that the military and society weren't equipped to heal. He struggled with PTSD that made sleep impossible and crowds overwhelming. He self-medicated with alcohol to quiet the nightmares and the hypervigilance. His marriage fell apart under the strain of a husband who'd returned from war fundamentally changed. He lost his job when his drinking and his trauma responses, the sudden panic attacks, the inability to focus, the explosive anger that erupted unexpectedly, made him unreliable. And without the structure and purpose that military service had provided, Bobby spiraled into homelessness with a speed that shocked him. According to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's 2023 Annual Homeless Assessment Report, approximately 33,000 veterans experience homelessness on any given night in America. That's 33,000 people who served their country, who took an oath to defend it, who put their lives at risk, and who are now sleeping on streets, in shelters, or in places not meant for human habitation. The causes are complex: PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, substance abuse often rooted in untreated pain or trauma, lack of affordable housing, gaps in VA services, and the challenge of translating military skills to civilian employment. Bobby's story contained elements of all these factors, but the core reality was simple. The country he'd served had failed to catch him when he fell. Bobby had been homeless for 8 months when the cafe incident happened. He'd been living mostly on the streets of Portland, Oregon, occasionally finding space in an overcrowded shelter, surviving day to day through a combination of VA disability payments that were barely adequate, occasional day labor, and the informal support network of other homeless veterans who understood the battles he was fighting. Bobby still wore his Marine Corps jacket, not out of pride exactly, but because it was warm, because it reminded him of the person he used to be, and because sometimes other veterans would see it and offer a moment of recognition or help that civilians rarely provided. But mostly, people looked through Bobby as if he was invisible, another homeless person to be avoided or pitied but never quite seen as fully human. On this particular Tuesday morning in November, Bobby had received his monthly disability payment and had decided to treat himself to something he rarely allowed. Sitting in a warm cafe with a cup of coffee, using the Wi-Fi to check his email and the job boards he religiously monitored despite rarely getting responses. He'd purchased a small coffee, carefully counting out exact change from crumpled bills and coins, and had been sitting quietly at a corner table for about 90 minutes, bothering no one, when the manager approached him. The manager, a young man named Travis in his mid-20s, looked uncomfortable as he asked Bobby if he was planning to order anything else. Bobby, recognizing the precursor to being asked to leave, explained that he was a paying customer and that the cafe's posted policy said customers could stay as long as they wished. Travis, clearly pushed by someone else to handle the situation, shifted uncomfortably and said that some customers had complained about feeling uncomfortable with Bobby's presence. Let's pause here to understand what was really happening. Bobby had broken no rules, had purchased a product, was using the space as intended. But his appearance, the worn clothes, the overstuffed backpack, the visible markers of homelessness, had made customers uncomfortable. They'd complain not about anything Bobby had done, but about what Bobby represented, the uncomfortable reality of poverty and suffering that people preferred not to see while enjoying their expensive lattes. Travis was enforcing not an actual policy, but the unspoken rule that certain types of people didn't belong in certain spaces, that homelessness was aesthetically unpleasing and should be hidden away. This is a pattern that plays out thousands of times daily across America, where homeless people are pushed out of public and commercial spaces not for their behavior, but for their status. Bobby tried to advocate for himself, pointing out that he'd paid for his coffee and that he had every right to be there. But Travis, feeling pressure from complaining customers and uncomfortable with the confrontation, made the decision to call the police to have Bobby removed. Within 15 minutes, 2 Portland police officers arrived, Officer Michael Chen and Officer Sarah Rodriguez. Both were relatively young officers, mid-career, who dealt with countless calls about homeless individuals. They approached Bobby's table with the practiced wariness that comes from not knowing if a call will escalate into something dangerous, and Officer Chen opened with the standard question. "Sir, we've received a complaint. The manager says you need to leave. Are you going to go voluntarily?" Bobby, who'd been through versions of this interaction more times than he could count, felt the familiar exhaustion of being treated like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. But he also felt something else in that moment, a deep weariness with running, with accepting mistreatment, with allowing himself to be erased from spaces where he had every right to exist. So instead of gathering his things and leaving as he'd done countless times before, Bobby made a different choice. He looked at the officers and said, "I'm a paying customer. I've broken no laws. I'm not leaving." Officer Rodriguez, trying to de-escalate, explained that technically the cafe was private property, and the manager had the right to ask anyone to leave for any reason. Bobby knew she was legally correct, but also knew that the selective enforcement, that white customers who sat for hours were never asked to leave while he was being removed after 90 minutes, was discriminatory even if it was legal. That's when Bobby made the phone call that would change everything. He pulled out his battered cell phone, a cheap prepaid phone that he kept charged at the public library and used sparingly to preserve the minutes, and dialed a number he'd been given months earlier by another veteran who'd told him to call if he ever really needed help. The number belonged to Colonel James Patterson, retired Marine Corps officer who'd served with Bobby in Iraq and who'd since dedicated his post-military life to advocating for homeless veterans. Bobby and James had served together 20 years earlier, had been close during their service, but had lost touch in the chaos of Bobby's decline. Bobby had been too ashamed to reach out when he'd first become homeless, too proud to ask for help from someone who'd gone on to success while he'd fallen apart. But in that moment, with police standing over him and the entire cafe watching his humiliation, Bobby swallowed his pride and made the call. When James answered, Bobby's voice was quiet but steady. "Sir, I need you at Morrison's Cafe on Southeast Hawthorne. Police are here. They're trying to remove me for being homeless." James's response was immediate. "I'm 15 minutes away. Do not leave. Put me on speaker so I can talk to the officers." Bobby switched the phone to speaker and held it up. James's voice, carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, addressed the officers. "This is Colonel James Patterson, United States Marine Corps, retired. The man you're attempting to remove is Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson, who served with distinction in multiple combat deployments. He's a decorated veteran who gave years of his life in service to this country. I'm asking you, officer to officer, if you have military experience, or citizen to citizen if you don't, to show him the respect he's earned and allow him to remain in the establishment where he's a paying customer until I arrive. The officers exchanged glances, the dynamic suddenly shifted by the intervention of someone with authority and credentials. Officer Chen, who'd done a tour in the army before becoming a police officer, responded with noticeable respect. "Sir, we're responding to a complaint from the business owner. If you're vouching for the veteran, we can wait for you to arrive before taking any action." James confirmed he'd be there shortly, and Bobby ended the call. The cafe had gone silent during this exchange. Customers who'd been complaining about Bobby's presence now watching with obvious discomfort as they realized they'd called police on a military veteran. Travis, the manager, looked uncertain about how to proceed, caught between the complaining customers who wanted Bobby gone and the growing recognition that removing a veteran might make the cafe look heartless. Colonel James Patterson arrived exactly 14 minutes later, and his entrance transformed the atmosphere completely. James was in his early 50s, fit and commanding in bearing despite wearing civilian clothes, and he moved through the cafe with purpose straight to Bobby's table. The two men's reunion was emotional in a way that made several customers tear up. Bobby standing with obvious difficulty, James embracing him without hesitation despite Bobby's disheveled appearance. Both men holding on longer than was probably comfortable for observers, but necessary for two warriors who'd survived hell together, and who were now reunited under circumstances neither had imagined. James turned to the officers and introduced himself more fully, showing military ID and business cards identifying him as director of Oregon Veterans Alliance, a nonprofit focused on veteran homelessness and services. He thanked the officers for their patience and professionalism, then turned to Travis the manager with an expression that managed to convey both disappointment and challenge. "This veteran has purchased coffee and is using your establishment as intended. What specific policy has he violated that justifies removal?" Travis struggled to articulate an answer that didn't amount to "customers don't like looking at homeless people," and James didn't let him off the hook. "So you're acknowledging that you called police to remove a paying customer who's violated no rules, solely because his appearance as a homeless person made other customers uncomfortable. Is that an accurate summary?" The cafe was completely silent now, every customer watching this confrontation unfold. James continued, his voice carrying throughout the space. "Staff Sergeant Thompson served multiple tour in combat zones, earned a Bronze Star for valor, and led Marines in some of the most dangerous operations of the Iraq War. When he came home, he was dealing with PTSD and traumatic brain injury, wounds just as real as if he'd lost a limb, but invisible and therefore ignored. The VA system that's supposed to support veterans like him failed. The employment system that's supposed to value military experience failed. The housing system that's supposed to prevent homelessness failed. And now, while he's sitting quietly in a cafe he has every right to be in, your customers, who have never served their country, never risked anything for the freedoms they enjoy, feel uncomfortable with his presence and you respond by calling police. That's not just unacceptable, it's a disgrace." The rebuke was scathing, and several customers looked genuinely ashamed. One woman started crying. A man stood up and said, "I'm one of the people who complained. I was wrong. I'm sorry." James accepted the apology with a curt nod but made clear his point wasn't about individual guilt. This isn't about any one person. It's about a society that thanks veterans for their service while simultaneously treating them as disposable when they're struggling. Every person in this cafe right now benefits from the security that Bobby and veterans like him provided. The least we owe them is basic dignity and the recognition that they belong in our communities, not pushed to the margins because their suffering makes us uncomfortable. James then did something that elevated the moment from confrontation to transformation. He pulled out his wallet, walked to the counter, and told the barista, "I'm buying coffee for everyone in this cafe right now. And while you're preparing those orders, I want everyone to hear Bobby's story, not because he needs your pity, but because you need to understand who he is and what brought him here." James returned to Bobby's table, sat down, and in a voice that carried through the now completely silent cafe, he told Bobby's story. The courage he'd shown in combat, the lives he'd saved, the leadership he'd demonstrated, the traumatic experiences that had changed him, the struggle to adapt to civilian life, the loss of family and job and home, the 8 months of homelessness while trying to navigate an overwhelmed VA system and a society that had forgotten him. Bobby sat listening to his own story told by someone who'd known him at his best, and the emotions flickering across his face, pride, shame, grief, gratitude, made him profoundly human to everyone watching. James ended by explaining the reality of veteran homelessness. Bobby isn't unusual. There are thousands of veterans in Portland alone who are homeless or housing insecure. Many are dealing with PTSD, traumatic brain injury, or other service-connected disabilities. They're not asking for special treatment. They're asking for the support that was promised when they signed up to serve. They're asking to be seen as human beings with dignity, not as problems to be hidden away. And they're asking that we, as a society, take responsibility for the fact that we sent them to war and failed to help them heal when they came home. The cafe's atmosphere had completely transformed. Customers who'd complained about Bobby were now approaching to apologize. One man, identifying himself as a veteran from a different era, shook Bobby's hand with obvious emotion. A woman asked James how she could help, and within minutes, multiple customers were pulling out business cards, writing down contact information, offering connections to jobs or housing resources. Travis, the manager, approached and apologized to Bobby directly, saying the cafe would comp his order and that he was welcome anytime. The officers, before leaving, provided Bobby with information about veteran-specific services offered through the police department and thanked him for his service, words that Bobby had heard countless times, but that felt meaningful in this context because they came after recognition of his current struggle rather than as a platitude that ignored it. But the most important thing that happened wasn't the public reconciliation or the offers of help, meaningful as those were. It was what James did next. He told Bobby, "You're coming home with me. We're going to get you into the VA's HUD-VASH program, housing vouchers specifically for homeless veterans. It should have happened months ago, and I'm going to personally ensure it happens now. And while we're working through the bureaucracy, you're staying in my guest room. You're not spending another night on the street." Bobby started to protest, started to say he didn't want charity or pity, but James cut him off. "This isn't charity. This is what Marines do. You were there for me in Fallujah when things got bad. I'm here for you now. That's how this works." The journey from that cafe to Bobby's eventual stability was neither quick nor simple. The VA bureaucracy, despite James's advocacy and connections, still moved slowly. Bobby had to navigate complicated application processes, prove eligibility, attend appointments, and deal with setbacks and delays that would have defeated someone without support. He struggled with shame about accepting help, with feeling like a burden, with the psychological adjustment of moving from survival mode to actually planning a future. He relapsed into drinking once during the process, disappeared for 3 days, and had to be tracked down by James and brought back to restart the recovery process. The path wasn't linear, and there were moments when Bobby doubted whether he deserved the help he was receiving or whether he was capable of rebuilding his life. But James and the network of veteran advocates he connected Bobby with didn't give up. They provided not just housing assistance, but wraparound services, therapy for PTSD, treatment for substance abuse, vocational training, peer support groups with other veterans navigating similar challenges. They helped Bobby access VA benefits he'd been entitled to, but hadn't known how to claim. They connected him with employers who specifically valued veterans and were willing to accommodate the challenges that came with service-connected disabilities. Most importantly, they provided community and purpose, reminding Bobby that he mattered, that his service had value, that his life was worth saving. 6 months after the cafe incident, Bobby had secured permanent housing through the HUD-VASH program, a subsidized apartment that, while modest, was his own space for the first time in years. He'd been sober for 4 months, attending AA meetings designed for veterans and benefiting from peer support of others who understood both addiction and military service. He'd found part-time employment doing facilities maintenance at a nonprofit, work that used his military logistics skills and didn't overwhelm him while he continued healing. He was attending regular therapy at the VA and had been prescribed medication that helped manage his PTSD symptoms. His daughter, who'd been estranged from him during his homelessness, had tentatively reestablished contact. Bobby's life was far from perfect. He still had hard days, still struggled, still carried the wounds of war and trauma. But he had stability, support, and hope for the first time in years. The Café incident and its resolution became a story that spread through Portland's veteran community and eventually gained national attention when a customer who'd recorded part of the confrontation shared it online. The video went viral, and James and Bobby both gave interviews about veteran homelessness, advocacy, and the failures of systems that were supposed to support those who'd served. But both men emphasized that the viral moment wasn't the point. The point was the 33,000 veterans experiencing homelessness across America who didn't have a colonel to call, who didn't have their struggles recognized, who were facing the same indignities Bobby had faced without intervention or support. James used the attention to advocate for policy changes and increased funding for veteran services. He testified before Oregon's legislature about gaps in the continuum of care for veterans. He worked with other veteran advocates to create a rapid response network in Portland where homeless veterans could be connected quickly to housing and services rather than languishing for months in bureaucratic processes. He partnered with businesses to create veteran-friendly employment programs and with landlords to expand housing options. And he consistently pushed back against narratives that treated veteran homelessness as inevitable or acceptable, insisting that a wealthy society that sent people to war had a moral obligation to support them when they came home. Bobby, meanwhile, became an advocate himself. He started volunteering with Oregon Veterans Alliance, using his lived experience to connect with homeless veterans who were skeptical of offered help or too ashamed to seek it. He spoke at schools and community events about his service and his struggles, humanizing homelessness and challenging stereotypes about veterans. He participated in policy advocacy, bringing the authentic voice of someone who'd experienced both the system's failures and its potential for success. His message was simple but powerful. Veteran homelessness was solvable if society chose to prioritize solutions, and veterans deserved not just gratitude for their service, but concrete support when they struggled. The cafe where the incident occurred also changed. Travis, the manager, partnered with Oregon Veterans Alliance to make Morrison's Cafe a designated veteran-friendly space. They trained staff on veteran issues and homelessness, created a policy explicitly welcoming veterans regardless of housing status, and participated in a program where homeless veterans could receive free coffee and a safe place to spend time. The cafe became known in Portland's veteran community as a place where they'd be treated with dignity, and multiple other businesses adopted similar policies after learning about Morrison's transformation. 3 years after the phone call that changed everything, Bobby was working full-time as a peer support specialist at the VA, helping other homeless veterans navigate the systems he'd once struggled with. He'd reconnected with his daughter and was building a relationship with his granddaughter. He'd been promoted to a management position, overseeing peer support programs. He'd testified before Congress about veteran homelessness alongside James. His life looked nothing like it had on that day, when he'd been sitting in a cafe hopping just to stay warm for a few hours before being pushed back onto the streets. In an interview marking the 3-year anniversary, Bobby reflected on what the cafe incident had taught him. I was invisible for 8 months. People looked through me like I wasn't there, or they looked at me with disgust or fear. That phone call didn't just connect me to James, it made me visible again. It reminded people that homeless veterans are still veterans, that we're still the same people who served, and that we deserve dignity even when we're struggling. But the real story isn't that James saved me. It's that our society needs to build systems where veterans don't need a colonel to call to get help, where we catch people before they become homeless, and where we treat everyone, veteran or not, with basic human dignity regardless of their circumstances. James's perspective complemented Bobby's. That phone call worked because I had privilege, rank, education, connections, resources. I could shame that cafe and those officers in ways Bobby couldn't, because society values my voice more than his, even though his experiences are more relevant. That's fundamentally unjust. We shouldn't need someone with authority to intervene for veterans to receive the support they've earned. The systems should work without individual intervention. Until they do, those of us with privilege have a moral obligation to use it to amplify the voices and needs of those who are struggling. The Café incident revealed several truths about how America treats its veterans and its most vulnerable citizens. First, that we've normalized homelessness to the point where pushing homeless people out of public spaces feels reasonable to many people who'd be horrified if they thought critically about what they were doing. Second, that veterans are honored in the abstract, but often ignored or mistreated when they're struggling in concrete reality. Third, that individual acts of advocacy and support can transform lives, but aren't substitutes for systemic changes that would prevent the problems in the first place. And fourth, that connection and community, the phone call from Bobby to James, the network of veteran support that caught Bobby and helped him rebuild, are essential to addressing social problems that government and private sector alone haven't solved. If you're a veteran who's struggling, Bobby's story is a reminder that asking for help isn't weakness, it's survival. Services exist, though they're often harder to access than they should be. The VA has resources specifically for homeless veterans, including the HUD VASH program that housed Bobby. Organizations like Oregon Veterans Alliance exist in many communities to help navigate bureaucratic systems and connect veterans to support. Peer support from other veterans who understand your experiences can be life-saving, and reaching out, making that phone call, might connect you to support you didn't know existed. You're not alone, your struggles don't negate your service, and you deserve help. If you're not a veteran, but encounter homeless veterans or homeless people generally, Bobby's story challenges you to see them as full human beings with histories, struggles, and dignity regardless of their current circumstances. The next time you feel uncomfortable about a homeless person's presence, ask yourself what that discomfort reveals about you rather than about them. Consider that they might be a veteran who served you, a parent who lost a child, a professional who faced impossible circumstances, a human being who deserves respect. And if you witness someone being mistreated for being homeless, speak up. The customers who apologized to Bobby did so only after James made them see what they'd done. Don't wait for someone else to provide moral clarity. Be the person who recognizes injustice and responds to it. If you're a business owner, Morrison's Café offers a model for how to transform from complicity in pushing out vulnerable people to actively creating welcoming spaces. Train staff to treat all customers with dignity regardless of appearance. Create policies that support rather than exclude homeless individuals. Partner with service organizations to be part of solutions. And understand that how you treat the most vulnerable people who enter your business reveals your actual values more than any mission statement or marketing campaign. If you're in a position to influence policy, Bobby and James's advocacy offers direction. We need increased funding for affordable housing, expanded mental health and addiction services, streamlined access to VA benefits, better employment programs for veterans, and interventions that prevent homelessness before it starts. We need to treat veteran homelessness as the moral crisis it is rather than as an inevitable reality to be managed. And we need to recognize that many of the systems serving veterans fail, not because of insufficient good intentions, but because of insufficient resources and political will. Here's the ultimate truth that Bobby's story reveals. That phone call didn't save Bobby. It connected him to a support system that should have been available all along without requiring personal connections to someone with authority. Bobby shouldn't have needed to call a colonel to get help. He should have had smooth access to services when he first became homeless. The VA should have caught him before he spent months on the streets. But in the absence of systems that work as they should, human connection and individual advocacy matter enormously. James's response to Bobby's call was what brotherhood looks like, what honoring service actually means, and what's possible when people with resources choose to use them on behalf of those struggling. If this story moved you, if it changed how you think about veteran homelessness or homelessness generally, Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that reveal the human experiences behind social issues we've learned to ignore.